Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. In an extensive biography of early 20th century British author and feminist Virginia Woolf, written by her nephew, Quentin Bell, the ancestry of his aunt and his mother, for that matter, sisters Vanessa and Virginia Stephen, is traced back on one side to a dealer in contraband goods, and on the other to a doctor who'd made his living caring for enslaved people in the West Indies so that they could be sent back to work. Born in 1879 and 1882, respectively, Vanessa and Virginia Stephen, along with their two brothers, Toby and Adrian, were each the products of their parents' second marriages. The four siblings' father, Leslie Stephen, a noted literary critic, historian, and editor of Great Britain's Dictionary of National Biography, as well as having been a well-known mountaineer and highly vocal agnostic who'd written extensively in defense of religious skepticism, had initially married a younger daughter of Vanity Fair author William Thackeray, whose mother, sadly, had suffered a severe case of postpartum depression following the birth of her child and eventually needed to be sent to an asylum until she died. Leslie Stephen and his first wife, Harriet, then themselves had a daughter named Laura in 1870, who, unfortunately, shortly after her mother's death in 1875, like her maternal grandmother before her, also became institutionalized until she passed away just before the end of the Second World War in 1945. Following his first wife's death, and the subsequent marriage of his sister-in-law, who had until then been managing his household, Leslie Stephen proposed to a recently widowed woman named Julia Duckworth, a very attractive, somewhat younger former model for the pre-Raphaelite painters who'd already had 4 children with her deceased husband, before later giving birth to a second set of 4 children with Leslie: Vanessa, Virginia, Toby, and Adrian. While their 2 younger brothers were sent to school, Vanessa and Virginia were initially educated at home by their parents. Virginia, becoming able to read the works of Homer in Greek by the time that she had been 8 years old, and the Stephen household frequently being visited by intellectual friends of her parents, including such individuals as novelist Henry James. This extensive blended family, however, was severely disrupted when Julia died in 1895, and 9 years later, when Leslie Stephen also passed away from cancer in 1904 at the age of 72, when his daughter, Virginia, had just been 13 years old, her 25-year-old stepbrother, George Duckworth, apparently taking advantage of the highly vulnerable emotional circumstances in what can only be described as an extremely inappropriate and sexually exploitive manner. After the death of her father, Quentin Bell says Virginia also experienced a nervous collapse, during which she is reported to have heard voices urging her to acts of folly, while also believing that she could hear birds singing to her in Greek, and that King Edward VII frequently whispered to her in the foulest possible language. It took several months for Virginia to recover, and she then went to stay with an aunt in Cambridge while her family home was sold and the new residence was established within the Bloomsbury section of London. Having initially written a periodical with her sister regarding events within the Stephen home, while in Cambridge, Virginia began to publish articles in a weekly newspaper called The Guardian, and in 1907, a group of friends of her brother Toby from Cambridge University began to regularly gather within the Stephen home on Thursday evenings, on one occasion as a prank. Several of them, including a bearded and turban-wearing Virginia, disguised themselves as the Emperor of Abyssinia and his entourage in order to receive a royal tour of a British naval ship and facility. Eventually, the Bloomsbury group came to include, after Toby had become ill on a trip through the Mediterranean dying of typhoid fever in 1906, author of A Room with a View, Howard's End, and Passage to India, E.M. Forster, economist John Maynard Keynes, American expatriate poet T.S. Eliot, short fiction writer Catherine Mansfield, and philosopher Bertram Russell, as well as art critic Clive Bell, who developed the aesthetic theory of significant form, and Leonard Woolf, the last two of these individuals subsequently marrying sisters Vanessa, a painter, and Virginia Stephen, becoming Mrs. Leonard Woolf in 1912 and describing her husband in a letter as a, quote, penniless Jew. The couple soon discovered that the new bride was sexually frigid, Virginia largely blaming this upon her stepbrother, George Duckworth. And a year after the wedding, she took an overdose of drugs, was found unconscious, having to have her stomach pumped by Maynard Keynes' doctor, younger brother, and George Duckworth then offered the couple an estate with servants, in which his half-sibling could recuperate from what appeared to have been a third nervous breakdown. A recent article in the Tribune explains that without their servants, the Woolfs and the Bloomsbury community would have been entirely helpless. By this time, Leonard Woolf had gone off and returned from service as a colonial administrator in Ceylon, as well as written 2 novels, and Virginia Woolf had written a full draft of her first novel, The Voyage Out. In it, a young woman named Rachel Vinrace embarks on a journey to South America, encounters a wide variety of fellow shipboard travelers, including Clarissa Dalloway, who would become the central character of Mrs. Woolf's 9th publication. But eventually, central character dies of a fever. The style of the book immediately surrounds a reader with the external world that it's describing, and it is this full immersion of the senses that was later expanded by Woolf into a wholesale embrace of the concept of stream of consciousness as initially conceived by Henry James' older philosopher brother William, and then fully manifest in by such writers as James Joyce within his novel Ulysses and T.S. Eliot in his poem The Wasteland. Within the decade between 1912 and 1922, Virginia Woolf experienced repeated onsets of depression, was advised to undertake a number of sessions of rest cure, which, according to Angus Fletcher in a chapter of his book Wonderworks titled Find Peace of Mind, required her to lie still and drink milk for weeks at a time. Sometime in 1915, the Woolfs acquired both a new home, Hogarth House, and a printing press that they set up in their living room and set the type themselves to establish Hogarth Press and publish, among other things, the first English translation of the complete works of psychoanalysis founder Sigmund Freud, which Leonard had begun to study in an attempt to better understand the issues being confronted by his wife, as well as T.S. Eliot's poetry and fiction by Catherine Mansfield. Agnes Fletcher also points out that on a warm Sunday evening in May of 1924, Virginia Woolf delivered a lecture to the Cambridge Heretics Society on the scientific revolution underway in modern psychology. And it was the insights into the blended nature of sense perception, memory, and conscious thought that became manifest in her novels, Mrs. Dalloway, The Waves, To the Lighthouse, and The Years. 2 years earlier, Hogarth Press had published Mrs. Woolf's third novel, Jacob's Room, in which the women in a young man's life, including his repressed art student mistress, provide a character study of a Cambridge student, Jacob Flanders, as he progresses into adulthood and eventually leaves London and travels to Italy and then Greece. Acknowledging the influence of James Joyce, Virginia Woolf further explored stream of consciousness in her 1926 publication of Mrs. Dalloway, relating a day in the life of the book's central character as she plans for a dinner party, recalls the past, learns of the suicide of a World War I shell-shock victim, veteran named Stephanis Smith, and reconnects with her former suitor, Peter Walsh, whose marriage proposal she had refused years earlier. In To the Lighthouse from 1927, Woolf represents the consciousness of as many as 14 different people in a tapestry of observation, memory, and thought that focuses on 2 days, which are divided by 10 years and the whole of the First World War. Beginning, as some critics have observed, in the middle of things, with an unspoken dispute between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, the parents of 8 children, as Leslie and Julia Stephan had been, about disappointing their young son James regarding the prospect of visiting a lighthouse across the bay from their summer home in the Scottish Hebrides. The initial day unfolds from the various points of view of the people assembled, husband and wife, children, house guests, including an atheist student of Professor Ramsay, and an amateur female painter who is told by the atheist that women can't really paint, write, or even think successfully. Mr. Ramsay additionally feels that marriage may have impeded his ambitions to achieve his potential of progressing as a significant intellectual from A to Z, leaving him somewhere around Q in his imagined alphabetical sequence. The initial section of the book ending with a silent wish for his wife to tell him that she loved him, which she recognizes but declines to do, thinking instead that he already knew she'd loved him and so it was unnecessary for her to say so. The next section of this 3-part novel compresses time and chronicles a number of unexpected changes. Mrs. Ramsay's sudden death, like that of the author's mother, the death of a son from a combat explosion during World War I, and the marriage and death of a daughter in childbirth, all packed into about 25 pages before a day 10 years after the beginning of the book, during which James, who as a 6-year-old had initially wanted to kill his father out of angry frustration at not going to the lighthouse, but successfully pilots the family sailboat and receives a compliment from his father, forgiving him for previous insensitivity, and the painting that had been begun a decade earlier is completed. Following year, Virginia Woolf published a time-traveling, gender-fluid novel titled Orlando, a biography. According to a Wikipedia article, it's about a male nobleman born during the reign of Elizabeth I, who undergoes a mysterious sex change at about the age of 30, and then lives on for more than 300 years into the modern age without himself perceptibly aging at all. Adapted for both stage and film, the narrative is said to have been inspired by the tumultuous family history of Virginia Woolf's female lover, Vida Sackville West. 1929, Virginia Woolf delivered a speech that became the basis for her publication, A Room of One's Own, in which she argued that the lack of educational and creative opportunity offered to women could only be overcome through obtaining an independent income and the separate space needed to achieve their full potential. This was followed in 1931 by what has often been described as Virginia Woolf's most experimental work, The Waves. Within this novel, 6 characters provide monologues which describe a man named Percival, who never speaks himself, offering an outline of that individual's character, which is interspersed with third-person descriptions of a coastline at various times of day, somewhat like Claude Debussy's 3 symphonic sketches, La Mer, or even Claude Monet's Seascapes, for that matter. Continuing to publish throughout the 1930s, Virginia Woolf released an additional 8 books before her suicide by drowning in 1941 at the age of 59, when, according to the note she left behind, she was seeking to avoid a recurrence of insanity and to spare her husband Leonard another period of distress and the need to provide for her care. These works included Letter to a Young Poet, The Common Reader, Flush, Roger Fry, a biography, and Between the Acts, with additional posthumous publications released by her husband, such as The Death of the Moth and Haunted House, including the beautiful Kew Gardens, with its amazingly rich descriptions of people, plants, and even a snail navigating the daunting obstacle of a fallen leaf that blocks its path. Also, there were Moments of Being and A Summing Up. But for me, at my age, perhaps some of Virginia Woolf's most resonant insights come from the character of Eleanor, which had been my mother's name, in fact, during a party towards the end of the years. My life, Eleanor repeated. Couples began to twist and turn slowly. It was a foxtrot that they were dancing, she supposed. My life, she said to herself. That was odd. It was the second time that evening that somebody had talked about her life. And I haven't got one, she thought. Oughtn't a life to be something you could handle and produce? A life of 70-odd years? But I've only the present moment. Here she was, alive, now listening to the foxtrot. Millions of things came back to her. Atoms danced apart and massed themselves. But how did they compose what people called a life? She clenched her hands and felt the hard little coin she was holding. Perhaps there is I at the middle of it, she thought. A knot, a center. And again, she saw herself sitting at her table. And then, from 54 or so pages later, how nice it is, she said, not to be young. How nice not to mind what people think. Now one can live as one likes, she added, now that one's 70. It is the incredible prose style that Virginia Woolf developed, combined with a depth of profound feeling and human insight, which stand out for me about her writing and make me feel that the answer to playwright Edward Albee's somewhat impertinent question from the mid-1960s, who's afraid of Virginia Woolf, simply has to be everyone. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.